Hello and welcome to Presqu'ile Provincial Park. My name is Sydney and I'm a naturalist here with the Friends of Presqu'ile. Today I want to take you on a virtual field trip here in our park. We are going to visit a few different habitats around the park and talk about biodiversity and invasive species. Does anyone know what the word biodiversity actually means? Let's break down the word into its two parts. The first part is bio, which means life or living things. The second part is diversity, meaning a variety of things. It's just like in your classroom. Everyone is not the same. You all look different, you all have different hair, you all dress differently, so there is diversity in your class. So then, biodiversity is the variety of living things. Now, why is biodiversity important? Why do we need a variety of living things in a habitat? Well, biodiversity helps to keep a habitat healthy, and when a habitat is healthy, then it can better deal with threats. For example, I am standing in one of our painting areas here in the park. Over here, we have a nice green lawn, and here we have a messy field. Now, we as humans, we really like the nice green lawn, but it's very low in biodiversity. If we were to take a closer look, we might find 4 or 5 different species here, but that's it. It's mostly just grass. Well, here we have a lot more biodiversity, not just in plants, but in insects too. But here on the lawn, the grasses would be gone, and there wouldn't be much left. Habitats are under threat all the time. They need biodiversity to be able to fight those threats. Here at Presqu'ile, we've had a number of events that have impacted our biodiversity, and this has led to invasive species being able to come in and take over parts of our habitats. Before we head out on our trip, I just want to make sure we all know exactly what an invasive species is. Have you heard that term before? Well, an invasive species is a living thing that is not native to an ecosystem and also causes harm. In order to be an invasive species, it must meet both of these criteria. Take, for example, this dandelion. Dandelions are originally from Europe, so that would mean they are not native to Ontario. But they're not considered an invasive species because they do not cause harm to an ecosystem. While we might not like them on our lawns, they don't take over a healthy habitat, like a field. So today, we are going to travel around the park and talk about 4 different invasive species and their impacts on Presqu'ile's biodiversity. So, I mentioned earlier that biodiversity helps to keep a habitat healthy so that it can fight off threats like invasive species. So you might be wondering, how did Presqu'ile have these invasive species come in? How did that happen? Are the habitats not healthy? Well, invasive species are very good at waiting. There might be a few of them in a habitat for years, and then something happens and they begin to spread. So invasive species often spread in habitats after there is a disturbance, meaning that something happens that impacts the biodiversity of the area. Here at Presqu'ile, one of those disturbances was once white-tailed deer. Around 15 years ago, Presqu'ile had too many deer. They were eating everything. All of the plants on the forest floor were impacted, but they didn't like the taste of this plant. One of the few plants left in the forests was this invasive species, and it began to spread. This is called garlic mustard. We can identify it by its little white flowers, and if you break the leaves, it smells like garlic. Garlic mustard is an invasive species, so I'm going to pick a piece of it off. But if it wasn't an invasive species, we wouldn't touch it. Now, if you were to break off a piece of garlic mustard, you would notice it smells like garlic. Ugh. Each one of these plants can produce hundreds of seeds, and all of the seeds can live in the soil for up to 30 years, just waiting for their chance to take over some biodiversity. As we look across the forest floor here, there's not much to see other than garlic mustard. Garlic mustard crowds other forest plants, so they grow fast, they grow early, and they interfere with fungus in the soil. Garlic mustard, like many invasive species, reduces biodiversity by crowding out native species and essentially taking over the forest floor. Now, we don't really know what makes a species go from introduced to invasive. Sometimes plants can be here for years before they start to cause any sort of issues. Take this plant, for example. Experts estimate that this plant was brought to North America in the mid-1800s, which means it's been in North America for over 200 years. This is Strangling Vine. It gets its name from the fact that it grows in thick mats of vegetation, and they're very hard to move through. So the idea is, if an animal ran through it, they would get stuck. So we talked before about how invasive species reduce biodiversity by basically taking over an entire habitat. If we look around here, we can see that Strangling Vine is the dominant plant across most of this area. So invasive species can have major impacts on plant life, but they can also have impacts on the animals that live here. Take, for example, the monarch butterfly. The caterpillars of monarch butterflies feed on milkweed plants. They use the toxins in milkweed to make themselves poisonous, but the Strangling Vine is in the same family as milkweed, so it can confuse the monarchs, and they lay their eggs on the Strangling Vine instead. Since the toxins are at a different level, The caterpillars cannot handle the toxins and they die before they can become butterflies. The dog strangling vine is hurting the monarch butterflies in two ways. It is taking over the fields, leaving very little room for the milkweed they need. And it also confuses them, so they lay their eggs on the wrong plant. So invasive species can have wide-ranging impacts on a habitat and the biodiversity of a habitat. Here we have another invasive species that has taken over this section of the trail. This plant is called the European buckthorn, named for the thorns on its branches. When the deer were eating a lot of the forest understory plants, they didn't like European buckthorn, so it was left alone. With little competition, the European buckthorn quickly took over the entire forest, as we can see here. Buckthorn grows very close together, which means that it creates a lot of shade on the forest floor, making it very hard for understory plants to get enough sunlight. It can also change the nitrogen levels in the forest soil, which helps the buckthorn to grow, but hurts our native plants. Now, you might be wondering, how do these invasive species spread all across North America? Well, most of the invasive species we see today are brought over to North America originally for use in gardens. European buckthorn was one such plant, but it was also planted around farmers' fields to act as a wind barrier since it grew so close together. Once here in North America, the plants were moved around by people, animals, and the wind. European buckthorn produces large black berries in the fall, and the birds love to eat them. When they fly off, they poop out the seeds somewhere else. So this is why you often see buckthorn along the edges of forests and along fences, places where birds really like to sit. While you cannot buy these plants for planting in your garden anymore, you can still spread the seeds on your shoes, on your bike tires, or on your dog. So it's always really important to clean your shoes, bike, and pets after going for a hike. I have one more species that I want to show you guys today, and for that, we'll have to head to the marsh. Let's go. The last invasive species I want to show you today is this plant here. These are Phragmites, or European common reed. Now, we do have a native species of Phragmites here at Presqu'ile, but we can identify the invasive ones by their height. Invasive Phragmites can grow up to be 5 meters tall. That's almost as tall as a giraffe. Our native Phragmites will grow alongside other native plants, but you wouldn't see them in large, dense stands like these. Like buckthorn, Phragmites like to grow very close together, often crowding out other native plants in the marsh. And it also releases a toxin into the soil to slow growth and kill surrounding plants, allowing it to spread even faster. Phragmites impact the animals that live here. Since it grows so close together, it's very hard for animals to move through it. And imagine you're a beaver trying to travel through the marsh. The stems would take a lot of work to climb through. So how do invasive species reduce biodiversity? First, they crowd out native plants and change the soil, making it hard for them to grow. This leads to less plant species growing in the habitat and less biodiversity. Second, invasive species negatively impact animals as well. They make it so that there is less food and less hiding spots for the animals. As a result, animals may leave this habitat in search of a better one. Therefore, there's less biodiversity. Today, we've explored some of the invasive species found at Presqu'ile and their impacts on biodiversity. I wanted to end our video today on a happier note by showing you a success story when it comes to invasive species. This plant here is called purple loosestrife. And it wasn't too long ago that marshes and roadsides were covered with this purple flower. Well, you can still find them here. They're not nearly as widespread as they once were. This is because, after years of research, scientists found a beetle that lived in Europe that liked to eat this plant, but left our native plants alone. It was introduced to various areas all around North America. Now, purple loosestrife has a predator here that likes to eat it and keeps the population of purple loosestrife under control. This is called biocontrol. And right now, scientists are working to find biocontrol methods for the other invasive species that we talked about today. So you might be wondering, what can I do? How can I stop the spread of invasive species? A great way to help is to teach other people about invasive species and their impacts on biodiversity. Make sure you always clean your camping and hiking equipment, especially when traveling to a new place, so that you don't take any invasive species with you. If you want to learn about ways that you can help control and remove invasive species in your schoolyard or at your home, check out invadingspecies.com. They provide lots of information on the best ways to control and remove invasive species. Thank you for joining me today on our virtual field trip around Presqu'ile Provincial Park. I hope you guys learned a little bit about invasive species and how they can affect biodiversity. Hopefully you guys can join us in person at the park very soon. Bye everyone!